Listen, no offense to the folks took yoga to vinyasa, hotter, still hotter yoga, nude hot yoga, nude hotter, more nude yoga with coffee and with wine and with weed. No offense. I hear you, man, go. But do we all understand that is perpetuating our current level of understanding? There has to be a change of momentum. For us to enter the sacred, there has to be a shift out of the normative mindset. And I think too often what we look for in complacency is to perpetuate our current level of understanding. Human beings bring two things to every environment. We bring content and we bring momentum. I mean, the great gift of yoga is its capacity to change our momentum.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today, my guest is one of the world's leading yoga and meditation teachers, Rod Stryker. Rod is the founder of ParaYoga and the author of The Four Desires, Creating a Life of Purpose, Happiness, Prosperity, and Freedom. Rod is renowned for making ancient wisdom and practices accessible to modern audiences. Raised in Los Angeles, Rod was just 19 years old when he began his study of yoga. He taught his first class in 1980, and he went on to teach here at Esalen. In addition to mentoring thousands of students worldwide, Rod also serves on the board of Give Back Yoga Foundation and is a featured faculty member of Yoga International. He is a father to 4 amazing souls and currently lives in Boise, Idaho. I'm also joined by my Esalen colleague and co-host today, Sadia Bruce. Sadia serves as head of Experiential Programming at Esalen, where she also teaches yoga in the tradition of Krishnamacharya. Sadia endeavors to create energized, radically inclusive learning environments that are guided by breath and driven by inquiry. She hopes to share an understanding of yoga that is integrative, sensorial, and enlivening. Sadia is also committed to bringing yoga and yoga-based practices to non-traditional environments and underserved populations, and to mentoring new teachers in relational dynamics, development of teaching voice, and teaching to economically, ethnically, and culturally diverse populations. So with no further ado, let's go to this conversation with myself, Rod Stryker, and Sadia Bruce.
I can think of something that was really defining in my life, which was really quite profound, which was just these two different streams of yogic teachings. So when I discovered Krishnamacharya's teachings, all along, Krishnamacharya would, for those who are not familiar with him, he was probably the most influential of all yoga teachers of the previous century. If you look at his lineage, it just maps out into these rivers of knowledge-based. Iyengar he touched Iyengar, he touched Pattabhi Jois, he touched Indra Devi, he touched his son, Deskachar, Vinay Yoga, and really just amazing in sense. But I was so drawn to his science of sequencing. I would offer that, yes, he was a master in so many ways, but his understanding of how we elegantly put together a practice is so meaningful. But meanwhile, he didn't really shed a lot of light on Tantra, which was really where I stepped into yoga and where it became so significant. And the Tantrics, in essence, Hatha Yoga has been sustained by the Natha. It was the Nath cult that really developed all of these methodologies that come under the heading of yoga, but very often they're not always taught together or seamlessly or even in a way where they're integrated in the West, whether it's asana and then pranayama and chakras and mudras and mantras. And we have knowledge of all of these methodologies and kriya and all sorts of even intentional techniques and bhav and all of these things. Well, Tantra is where that's the cauldron and where they're all brought together. The spirit of what I was teaching was tantric because of my early influence, the teachers I had early on. But I was so compelled by Krishnamacharya's sequencing knowledge. And it was only after starting to blend them on my own that I found out that Krishnamacharya's guru had the same guru as my tantric teacher. And it's this idea that there's nothing in the books, there's nothing historically that says they were the same. Krishnamacharya's teacher and my tantric grand teacher were the same human being, and yet completely different transmissions, if you will. When you feel that calling, we have to follow it.
It's also this line came to me in a meditation once. It was, the future is ancestral. And so this thing that you've described, this accidental discovery of, the one root teacher, is like, I think that's what's next for everyone. We keep doing all this syncretic stuff. I had a conversation with Michael Murphy the other day, and this phrase came to me. It was like, what everyone is doing is like fractal syncretism. It's just, we just compiling and compiling reinterpretations and reinterpretations. But eventually, I think what we will arrive at, and I don't know when this might be a thing that's not attached to time, but we'll arrive at what does J. Krishnamacharya say? Truth is a pathless land.
Another point around that, because I was so curious that how could these two paths of knowledge, Krishnamacharya's sequencing, for example, and Tantra, and he never spoke about Tantra. My teachers never spoke about sequencing, and you just did the sequences, but I never gained any actual knowledge about it. I had to interpret it. How could a single teacher provide the path of understanding of these two such distinct paths? How could a single teacher kind of like be such separate appearing, I would say, what appeared to be separate paths? And I was told, my teacher, who was a grand student of this teacher, said, he was such a master that he provided a completely different transmission for different students. So he saw what Krishnamacharya was meant to carry. He saw what Swami Rama was meant to carry. And that's the kind of, wisdom. And it also speaks to how each of us, in a way, is a unique vessel meant to carry on a unique transmission that, in a way, is a sharing and if you will, a beacon to guide people to their understanding. And there's clearly people who I can speak to that will hear you better than will hear me. That's part of the beauty of it.
Everyone does have their own approach. And for me, I'm interested in scripture and I'm interested in these things, but what I've discovered and what I have learned to become okay with is that is not my lane necessarily. My lane it's something about the energy of the transmission, what it is to cultivate presence so that someone who is good at absorbing knowledge and information, they can alchemize it so that it is presented to folks in a way that they can digest it and enjoy it, be with it, and then go interpret it for themselves.
In the West, the idea of innovation is super attractive. If it's new, it's actually great and it's interesting and it's compelling and it's sexy, for lack of a better word. In the East, it's the opposite. What innovation is actually suspect. It's called Shruti for a reason. And what distinguishes all paths in the East, in essence, especially within Tantra and Hinduism and Veda, is whether or not you accept the ancient teachings as Shruti, which means heard. They weren't written, they were heard. And what distinguishes those paths is to say, oh, these were heard, and they're absolutely the foundation upon which all teachings must be built, because they were not written, they were not crafted. And so ahead of time whether something is actually holds to this idea of Shruti or not. You know that. And that's why, and in a sense, that speaks to this idea of how vibrant and how vital and how irrefutable, in a way, those heard teachings are. And if you're going to veer away from them, then just let's acknowledge that we're not accepting them as Shruti, as having been heard.
It reminds me of jazz and Coltrane and any other jazz musician. Actually, you must learn your scales first before you can do the thing that's so exciting. Coltrane loves Stravinsky, and I tell this to teacher training students a lot who are excited to be creative as a teacher. Creativity good, but scales even better. Yeah. Scales even better. I also do this this little party trick where I'll show them two portraits. One is kind of a classically rendered portrait. The other one is like this cubist, exciting, oh my gosh, what is that? And I ask them, which one is more interesting to you? Which one has a little more juice? And invariably they choose the second cubist abstract thing. And I reveal to them that they're both Picasso. and that the original one is a portrait that Picasso painted of his mother early on in his art studies, and that the second one is the one that he arrived at through, deep study of reality, of truth, of what is.
Rod, preparing for this interview, I listened to several interviews that you did, and one thing that impressed me about you was that you are a kind of person who's willing to interrogate his own beliefs. And I want to kind of like get into the idea of teacher as fallible, acknowledging the dynamic between teacher and student, acknowledging the power dynamic there too, and how that can inform us, those of us who are interested in being teachers, how that can inform our practices.
We're probably more challenged by this idea than ever. Part of the reason is that there's been a shift in ethos that's cultural and social, some of which is really important and helpful. And that is a kind of leveling the playing field. Now, we have this dynamic, as I started to say, the moment someone is in the front of the room and giving direction, there's already a power differential. So how do we navigate that? Do we reject it just on the basis of the idea that the moment there's power differential, it needs to be annihilated? Well, then how do you teach? That's impossible to teach unless you're teaching in a circle, which is a viable way to teach, but it's a very different way to teach and receive teachings. I think sooner or later, if we are to learn, there has to be a dynamic. There has to be this element of walking into the dynamic of teacher and student, but to do it as mindfully as possible. We all know that in psychology and psychotherapy, it is assumed that sooner or later there'll be projection and there'll be transference. That's assumed. And it's almost declared sooner or later. When you start getting pissed off at your therapist, or you start feeling attracted to your therapist, or you start feeling overattached to things that they say, it's a rife opportunity for projection. So we know the moment there's power differential, there will be distorted perception. And by the way, on the behalf of both individuals, the teacher is idealized perhaps, or its opposite version, whatever the antithesis of being idolized is, or seen as on a pedestal. The challenge we face, because I do think having a relational, and I'm using that word, I want to use that word carefully, but there being a relational context to our learning is vital, because to be purely transactional, which is I'm getting information from this person, I'm not going to see them as other than my equal, and I just want to get the information and be able to teach it on Monday after I received it on Saturday. I would say that a formative part of my development actually occurred because I did walk through projection and other elements in my relationship to my teacher. I had to consistently be disappointed in not getting what I wanted from my teacher. But I brought a kind of willingness as a student in those days to say, your disappointment is more about you than it is about them. What I say is that, look, we all want to learn, but we don't all have the same relationship to being taught. We all want to know. Listen, my first teacher was very clear with me. He said, Rod, a student should be as careful who they select as a teacher as the teacher should be selective about their students. And in this day and age, we're now teaching, and lots of teaching, the majority of teaching, I would say, is happening remotely. There's no selectivity about who's studying with you. I would say in my own life experience as a teacher, having done it for over 40 years, is to be extremely, like everything else, really clear about what it means to you, and really to simply be of service to students with no personal validation. And I mean, it almost goes without saying in a way. That's really the critical piece.
What's coming up for me is just how different my experience of this, the all powerful, the power differential that everyone speaks of. And so, as we know, how we're received by people is very much colored by our social location. I'm in a very unique position because I often teach where folks are white, they're older than I am. And so my way of maneuvering the space as a as a teacher or leader of any kind, it's very fascinating. I've conducted all kinds of experiments as I learn and I grow through this process. At Kripalu, I used to lead this conscious communication workshop. And I'd have folks file in and they wouldn't know who was teaching. So they'd, maybe a name would be there, but no photo or anything. So, and folks were just passing through. So they would file into the room. For whatever reason, maybe it was the description, but this workshop really magnetized people. So folks would file into the room and I'd just be off to the side. This is part of the experiment, to not be sitting in the front of the room as they filed in, just let them file in. So they would file in. And then, I would walk to the front of the room. This was maybe a handful of years ago. And I would just have to contend with feeling the energy of confusion, of shock, positive emotion as well. But it was just you could feel it. And so I'd have to navigate that, wait for it to peter out a little bit, center the room, and then start speaking. And after I would speak for a little while, you would watch the energy in the room start to shift. And so little things like this, they're happening all the time.
So you said you could feel it. And that is the it that you sensed in the group, was that, oh, I am going to be led by a young woman of color?
Yeah. I thought I was alluding to it clearly enough, but that's exactly it. I'm going to be led by, for sure. Yeah, that's exactly it.
And they were you could feel them kind of trying to reorient them. It wasn't going to be a white middle-aged man.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And thanks for asking for the clarification, because this is such a part of it's just the way that I have to move in the world that I don't even realize that folks don't quite understand what I'm talking about if I'm not explicit. So it's helpful that you keep teasing it out. And then the other flip side of it is that as a student, I went to school in a suburb, relatively mixed suburb, but still pretty pronounced racial dynamics. And so I had some negative experiences with teachers from the time I was a small child. And so for me to begin to study yoga and embodiment practices, I've never pedestalized the teacher ever. And it's because I was primed to not trust them, to be skeptical. And so when I hear folks, in the yoga world talk about the power differential, it doesn't quite land for me. It's not relatable for me. I get it. I see it. But my own personal experience is quite the opposite, where there is a heightened skepticism. And I won't even go study with a person if I have even a little inkling that, we won't resonate, or they won't offer what I need, or perhaps they won't be able to receive me as a student, or whatever it is. There's a heightened skepticism.
The wholesale dismissal of learning in an environment where there is built-in power differential, I think people will really be missing something as a result of that. The fact that you don't burden the opportunity of learning with this elevating to this pedestal piece is a gift. I don't suggest that getting to the place where you could do that was easy. I'm not suggesting that at all. It sounds like it was, you had to develop scar tissue, and there were events that led you to that place. But it's a gift to actually enter into that space, open to learn, and yet not idealizing. Listen, in the end, we're all human beings. I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I'm not that familiar with him, but, there was an event many decades ago, early on in my teaching, probably more than 30 years ago. And he was asked a question, and he began to weep. He began to cry. He was asked a simple question. The question was, how long will it take for me to master meditation? He just bowed his head and started to cry. And he lifted his head and he said, a long time. A long time. The idea that there's a stage where we become unhuman, and I would tell you from my own experience that there's very few teachers in this world who have escaped the transactionalism of having to deal with fundamentally addressing their fears of survival, their fears of having an identity, their fears of place in the world. There's almost no one, and now I'm talking about some of the individuals who walked the halls of Esalen as well, for sure. And some of those stories are well publicized about their humanity. I would also offer that there are degrees to which teachers will go to places where they're not where they step out of being conscious. There's degrees. It's not one large pool. Everyone is created equal in terms of their humanity and their frailty, if you will. I think some of those nuances have been lost, unfortunately. But listen, man, there is nothing more profound as a teacher than relationship. This is corroborated. If you look at the neurological science, it actually tells us the most complicated operation for the brain, the human brain, is relationships. The reason human beings dream more than any other primate is because we spend a lot of time trying to figure out, our brain is processing the burden of the complexity of our social engagement. And so, yes, all of these methods present and offer powerful tools for self-reflection. But lo and behold, it's relationship where we, as much as anything else, learn about ourselves.
In kind of modern Western culture, hierarchy has been misused in a lot of traditional cultures, including the ones that I claim as my own, that are my own. Hierarchy, especially in familial structure, is very present all the time. And so you kind of grow up with this understanding that you're being guided by someone. It's part of just your everyday life. And I think in kind of modern Western culture, that kind of hierarchy, it has been broken down for a long time. For example, I remember growing up as a kid, and this is maybe, like the early 90s, and I had a couple of friends who would call their parents by their first names. And that's something that a lot of people of different cultures, African American culture, certainly various African cultures in Asia, you would never do that ever. And so I think in our culture, folks are starting to adopt these practices. They're trying to, I suppose, they're trying to overlay this Western cultural understanding of hierarchy onto this system that was born of a completely different worldview.
I would just say, it's a time of delicacy around navigating this idea. Are we still teachable? And if we are, can we bring discernment to those environments where we can be taught, both on the part of the person teaching and on the person receiving those teachings? Let's put it in absolute terms. Absolute dismantling of hierarchy in a learning environment doesn't actually lead to necessarily evolutionary shifts.
Yeah, and I'll go so far as to say that it's actually dangerous for a student to enter a room with no container that is intentionally held by someone who has power.
Yeah.
And it's funny to watch, just the glamorization of teaching, of especially yoga teaching as a profession. It's wild. And so
what does that look like to you from where you are?
for sure. It's something, I think I was mentioning in our last conversation that I started teaching at around like the tail end of like the heyday of the New York yoga scene, where all teachers were passing through. You were passing through a whole bunch, so many folks. And I would try to study with as many people as possible. There was quality yoga to be found almost everywhere. And as I started to teach, I really resisted. This was around the time that Instagram was in use. It was just on the scene in 2013. And you would watch as, folks would post themselves doing asana and this and that. And for some reason, something in me, it just didn't land well for me. It didn't seem appropriate. To me, I used to joke with people that seeing someone do asana on Instagram was like watching them like use the bathroom or something. Like why are we broadcasting why are we broadcasting this intensely intimate personal moment? And I don't know what in me was the driving force that, had me resisting and resisting and resisting, because I think it would have been quite easy just to, sometimes I think about doing it today, like just put a bunch of photos on the internet and call it a life, get some people to sponsor you, be this commercial figure and do all this weird, meaningless stuff. And life will be much easier, much easier.
Yeah. Yeah.
But something in me just, I don't know. And I don't know if it's related to what we were addressing in our original conversation about some of us, we have this dharmic call and we have to answer it. And so maybe substance is mine, maybe integrity.
It's fair to acknowledge that just because we're moving forward doesn't mean we're evolving. It's quite possible to devolve. Forward movement isn't necessarily evolutionary. And that piece you mentioned about IG is not insignificant. I mean, yoga's already peaked. Yoga has peaked just in terms of the sheer number of people doing it. It's peaked by a lot. And that's the first time it's declined in that 30-year climb out of the obscurity of, the early, late 70s. It's the first time the numbers have seriously are in decline at all. I would offer that part of it is what happened there. Glamorization, but the way you're describing, it's really like putting at the forefront of those teachings the most superficial stuff. I too was struck by it. I was watching it happen. I too was not, my sensibility and yours are in a lot of alignment. So I didn't dive into that thing at all. And then I began to see, there was one or two, and actually two influencers in the yoga world who did an Oprah, who got, even a feature on Oprah, and they were at around 2 million followers. And one of them had the, I'll say audacity, if you will, had the audacity to say, no, I don't study anymore. My people need me just to be present. This kind of thing that's happened in a way, again, it's a super level playing field. In a sense now, acknowledging that you didn't invent these teachings, where they came from, that there are people with knowledge that's more senior to you, that doesn't really exist anymore. Part of it is this teaching has become non-localized. It's literally we're teaching in a quantum field, which is remotely. And you aren't competing for the students when you're at Esalen, just at Esalen, or if you were based in New York, New Jersey. Those are your peeps. You were very comfortable. What I observe is people were very comfortable saying, yeah, my teacher's in Colorado. And if you ever get to Colorado, you should study with him. Or if he ever comes to New York, you should stay with him. But now, because it's non-local, people don't say, hey, my teacher is there, because those classes now, because of post-Zoom era, we're teaching to everyone in the world. And so it's like just holding on to those bodies of students that they don't have to be in our location. So all of these various things, including the big piece you touched on, which is the glamorization of yoga teacher, have led to kind of this moment in time where I think it's a reassessment of the whole field.
I took this class called Sociology of the Body at Columbia, and I wrote this paper proposal. I was going to write about sort of the commercialization of yoga, but also just the teaching for a little while. Now it's shifted because we're becoming more inclusive and this and that. But, yoga, I think as a hobby was something that was done by women, white women of a certain class for a little while, little block of time. And so I think it coincided with this rise of IG. And so you would see these women who were practicing or teaching, had become teachers very quickly, and they would be depicting these lifestyles that people would say, oh, wow, then I have to become a yoga teacher so I can live like that. Not realizing, all of the kind of social underpinnings, that make that delusion or that illusion possible. And so that is also super interesting to me. It's shifted now, but that was a thing for a while. And so people would go to yoga teacher trainings, not to deepen their practice, but to become a yoga teacher. And in fact, that's still happening a lot, where they are privileging teaching and forgetting about studentship. And I think I shared with you, Rod, at some point, this quote from Ronnie Coleman, 8-time Mr. Olympiad. He said, everybody wants to be a bodybuilder, but nobody wants to lift any heavy ass weights. And that's what's happening. Everybody wants to be a bodybuilder. No one wants to lift weights. Everyone wants to teach. No one wants to practice.
I think it's Thoreau. He wrote that the path of least resistance leads to crooked rivers and crooked men.
In certain circles, people, they're doing the yoga of complacency. They're doing a yoga that does not rupture their worldview or their orientation. It keeps them in this very easy, everything's beautiful kind of groove. And so that reminds me of this river with no currents, or this, river with no resistance. Certain folks who are not interested in friction or effort or rupture, disruption, fire.
Within the context of a class, what does the opposite of the yoga of complacency look like or entail?
It looks like what Rod teaches. Yeah, it looks like tending to the inner fire.
there can't be complacency in true learning. Learning is very much the way Sadia is describing it. Sooner or later, I'm going to come up against my boundaries, my limits. It's my understanding that discomfort is essential to create new neural pathways. Our brain will not actually develop a new neural pathway unless we get uncomfortable. Now, I'm not of the mind that a teacher should deliberately make what they do uncomfortable. But I think for our conversation to have provide some answers and sense of guidance for students. I mean, if you're not prepared to be made uncomfortable at some point, you're really not prepared to study very much, or perhaps even have a teacher. The one thing that maybe because of my background in psychology, I just knew I could it wasn't my first response, in all honesty, but eventually I would always know that my discomfort with my teacher or the teachings had everything to do with me and relatively little to do with them. And that, I think, is something, again, that we have discomfort about. So let's go back to Sam's question, because I'd love to hear the answer. What does that look like, Sadia, this opposite of complacency?
Yeah, well, I'll just share something that I often offer students. And in these days, I'm not really teaching asana. I'm teaching this kind of interesting, syncretic, playful practice that is very just alive and gets folks to be in their bodies. But I'm often sharing with them that, to be very watchful of the workings of the mind as they're doing practice. Sometimes we'll come up against movements or patterns of movement that do create a little bit of friction. And so I invite them in those moments to just watch their patterning around meeting this manufactured challenge. And, if you notice that your patterning feels generative, where you're curious, you're just applying right effort, you can keep going, you can keep breathing. Wonderful. If you're noticing something else, what can you do to calibrate your experience so you're still inside of the challenge without falling away or without hurting yourself? And so it's about finding balance.
I would add to that, because I think you're onto something really strong, and that is, fundamentally, there has to be a change of momentum. And the idea of what you spoke to earlier about Instagram, it kind of was meeting a lot of people where they were, or really where they wanted to be, which was just an extension of where they already were. Most of those, I'm thinking about these two influencers who crossed the 1 million mark on yoga follows. They were bikinis on the beach. No offense, but that was the allure. One person in particular, just every day was a beach and a different bikini and a shot. And I would offer that's meeting people where either they are or where they want to be. It's kind of this aspirational privilege, if you will. What I teach, Sam, and maybe this is what I think Sadia may have, I don't know, I'll read into it. This is maybe what you were alluding to. There has to be a change of momentum. For us to enter the sacred, there has to be a shift out of the normative mindset. And I think too often, what we look for in complacency is to perpetuate our current level of understanding. Human beings bring two things to every environment. We bring content, my past experiences, my learning, my rational mind, what I've been taught, my beliefs, and we bring momentum. I mean, the great gift of yoga is its capacity to change our momentum. You could say that by slowing things down, the parts of you that are not working get even more acute. And the parts of you that are working, you will call into question when we slow down. There's this objectification of ourselves, our minds, all the stuff we bring to the table. That, to me, is the opposite of complacency. That's the antidote to the complacency, is we change momentum. There is great discoveries and extraordinary things to know about what we are. But our current event horizon, our current level of perspective doesn't allow us to see it. And in that furthering of our perspective, naturally, what we'll begin to do is run up against the limits of perspective. The moment we are more aware, we recognize how unaware we were previously. And that's discomfort. That is discomfort. There's even a grief about, oh, hell, I was walking through life with all this misunderstanding. Damn, hold on. And that's when learning becomes, for lack of a better word, real. That's when learning really starts to happen. And then finally, that other piece is when we change our momentum, we get a little bit more still. It's not about perpetuating, listen, no offense to the folks who've been, took yoga to vinyasa, hotter, still hotter yoga, nude hot yoga, nude hotter, more nude yoga with coffee and with wine and with weed. No offense. I hear you, man, go. But do we all understand that is perpetuating our current level of understanding? It's this word that's used about in yoga from the beginning. It's all about tapas. We need a certain amount of heat, a certain amount of friction to light the match of knowledge. There are 4 different shadows that lay over the mind, and the mind, informed by these 4 veils or shadows, is unable to grasp the totality of who we are. Now, those 4 things are animus, so anger, a lack of compassion, judgment for those who we believe are less virtuous than we are, and envy of those who are perhaps more in our eyes, more advanced spiritually. I mean, I'll go through them again real quick. So it's anger, withholding compassion, judgment, and envy. I'm not going to talk about the rest of the world. I'm going to talk about the yoga world. In essence, those 4 things have become normalized. We feel entitled to our anger. We definitely feel entitled to who we judge as being inferior to us. We withhold compassion consistently, both to ourselves and to others, by the way. And so if you go through them, what I would offer is that kind of, what's so intriguing is when you introduce these concepts and there's actually contemplations to resolve each one of those 4 things, people are like making these discoveries about themselves and the weight of their judgment or their withholding of love, which texts are describing as cruelty. When you withhold compassion, that's cruelty. I would offer in the yoga world, not only has the river gotten crooked, based on that earlier quote, right? That the path of least resistance, but it's almost like we've lost the objective awareness that tells us like, hey man, I can't embody the Dharma, the Tao, the way, these key principles, if I hold these 4 stains of the mind as normal and acceptable. And I'm not saying they don't have a place in life, but they don't actually allow you to progress spiritually. It's one more piece that says, hey, we need to dig deeper into our own self-understanding and self-inquiry to embody more of this thing called yoga and to ultimately be set free, which is the ultimate promise of what these teachings are all about.
Rod Stryker, it's been such an honor and a privilege to speak with you today. And Sadia Bruce, thank you so much for co-hosting with me and co-interviewing. For folks who want to check out more of Rod Stryker's offering, you need only visit his website, rodstryker.com. That's RODSTRYKER.com. Yeah, you can reach him and experience more of his teachings there.
Pleasure, Sam and Sadia.
Yes, thank you.
Joy to be with you and see you. You're an inspiration.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you. This is beautiful.
Thanks so much for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show was produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. Esalen Institute is a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing human potential and promoting positive social change. Your support helps us to continue to offer transformative programs and retreats that promote personal growth and collective well-being. To learn more about Esalen and how you can support our mission, visit our website at esalen.org.